Wow. Hey, thanks for staying late. I appreciate it. I will tell you what, I will make a deal with you. Let's spend a little bit of time putting the last few ideas into our brains here. Then let's go outside and drink them all back out again. Does that sound good? All right. Excellent. So a couple months ago, I quit my job. Thank you. I had been working for the last 3.5 years or so at Adobe, which made me laugh this morning when Simon asked all of you how many had switched from Photoshop to Sketch, and there was applause. So, but actually, what that really does is validate a lot of what we were working on there, which was this kind of core belief that we had, that the way that we do our work, the people in this room, right, the way we do our work today looks nothing like it did the years ago when most of Adobe's products were conceived. So that led to a tremendous amount of opportunity in the tools that we all use. And I worked on that for a while at Adobe, and then I switched jobs, and I have a new job, which honestly echoes another thing that Simon said this morning in his talk, which is that I have no idea what I'm doing now. I am now a partner in a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley, which, thank you, which if you think is kind of a weird job for a designer to have, you're absolutely right. We, as designers, didn't really have a seat at the other side of the table on the entrepreneur side until just a few years ago, and now we see lots of examples of that, like Airbnb and Pinterest and services like that, founded and run by designers. But I have this hypothesis, and that is that companies that are user-centered and design-led are much more viable. And I mean not just user-centered and design-led in how they do their product development, but every part of how they run their company, which is why I'm very inspired by designers as entrepreneurs, and that's what I'm spending a lot of my time working on. Now, I come from California, so it'd be very easy for me to stand up here and just talk about money all the time, but I realize that I'm in Europe, so instead, we'll talk about culture. How's that sound? Good. So I would like to talk about how we craft a creative culture within our teams. And I would like to start doing that with a little visualization exercise with all of us. And don't worry, it's not some weird San Francisco hippie thing. I just want you to imagine a scene like this, where you're out on a lake and you're in a canoe. It's very still and it's very quiet. The sun has just risen. There's mist over the lake. You're paddling along. It's peaceful. When all of a sudden, there's a big bump and a splash, and you find yourself in the water. And you come up, sort of gasping for air, and you look around at what happened, and you see a group of teenagers pointing at you and laughing at the big joke they just did, and they swim away. Think about the emotions that you would feel in that moment. Hey, very good. Rage, I would imagine, might be a description of what you, sir, were experiencing just then. But perhaps even humiliation or even fear, all of those emotions. Now hold on to that a second. Let's rewind and go back into the boat. It's peaceful again. The sun has just risen. We're paddling along. And again, there's a bump and a big splash, and you find yourself in the water, and you come up. And this time, you see that it's just a piece of driftwood, that you've run into a log and it flipped and upset your boat and dumped you into water. Would you have the same emotions? Would you be furious at the log? Would you be humiliated by it? Would you be afraid of it? Probably not. But in both cases, you're experiencing pretty human things, a set of emotions. And what I want to start off today with is this idea of feeling and acting the same way in both situations. An understanding of the emotions that we feel in an instant, in a very human way, and an ability to cope and deal with them in a way that is wise and is measured. There's a term for that I'm really fond of. It's called equanimity. Right? And the textbook definition of that is a state of mental or emotional stability, especially in a difficult situation. We have a phrase for that I hear all the time, which is grace under pressure. So let's hold on to this word, equanimity. And I want to tell you a story that sort of illustrates how I came across this and sort of practiced this. This is a story that happened a number of years ago, before I was at Adobe, when the company that I had co-founded, Typekit, was still a startup. And it was a December morning, and it was about, it's about 6:24 in the morning, when I woke up, not to my alarm, but to the sound of splashing water, which was unusual in my house. So I went over to the bathroom where the sound was coming from, and this is what I found. Now, the good news is, I know who this is. The bad news is, he was on his third roll of toilet paper, just really jamming them down in there. Very proud of his work. Any of you who are parents, now you can start to understand this idea of equanimity. Calm, measured emotions in a state of crisis. So we sorted all of this out, and I went downstairs and started my day the way I normally do, which is to log into the chat room to see what's going on. And I realized at 6:30 in the morning on a weekday in December, before the sun was even up, that there was a lot of activity happening. A lot of it, engineers were online and stuff was going back and forth and happening. And they were talking a lot about some of these statistics. So I look at the board where we have all of our measurements and graphing about the performance of the system, and I see a chart like this. So let me give you a little data visualization lesson. If you look really closely at the red all the way across, something really awful happened right there. You can just make it out, I think. This was very bad. We were kind of in crisis mode. And I'll explain this in a minute by way of sort of telling you a little bit about how the back end of the systems that these engineers were dealing with behaves. So Typekit does a thing where you put some code on your website and we load web fonts onto the page for you. Users do that by clicking around, finding the fonts that they want, selecting ones they want, and then bringing open an interface that allows them to configure it by putting some CSS selectors or IDs or tags or anything like that. You configure all of that and then push the button that says publish. And when that happens, some fonts, some font files, some code, and some database queries all kind of combine together on the back end and produce a thing that we call a kit. It's sort of this metaphor of all of these pieces together that are going to present the proper fonts on the proper website at the right time when they're requested. The way that happens is that kit, once it gets put together by all the back-end services, gets moved over to a thing called a CDN, a content distribution network. And particularly, that kit gets placed on a computer at the CDN called an origin server. That origin server then propagates the kit out to the rest of the world. Because, as many of you know, performance is king when it comes to building websites, and the speed of light matters. So you want your content, whether they're web fonts or ad banners or kitten videos, you want them as close to your users as you can possibly get them because they'll load faster. So that's how the system kind of works. Now, back to this chart. This chart shows the number of kits that have been created by people pushing the publish button that are in a queue to go over to the CDN, which means they're not going. They're stuck, right? And the queue is filling up, and this is kits per second, and it's growing, and it's growing, and it's growing. So what essentially is happening is in that visualization I showed you earlier, the kits are simply accumulating on our servers, but nothing is going over to the CDN. So we all get into the office, we do our morning stand-up, and we're talking about this exclusively. Nothing else is on the agenda. What is happening? And it turns out that during the hour or so between when the problem started and we had our stand-up, the engineers have uncovered that one of our partners who uses our APIs to put fonts on their customer websites is doing an extraordinary amount of traffic. It's a service called About.me. It does personal profile pages. And as you can see, they all have different fonts, and there's this interface that uses our API to let users take the font and essentially put a Typekit font with a single click onto their profile. But they're going crazy today. It's extraordinary amount of traffic. And so I call up the CEO and say, hey, you guys are doing great. What's going on today? And he's like, hey, we opened the doors today. And I'm like, thanks for telling me. That's great. Congratulations. And he's like, oh, yeah, it's been fantastic. We're getting all kinds of press. But guess what? On Monday, we're announcing that we've already been acquired by AOL, and we've got coverage in the Times and the Post, and it's going to be in TechCrunch again. It's going to be huge. And I'm like, that's great. That's so awesome. And the whole time I'm talking to him, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, be calm. It's okay, it's okay. And also, this is a perfect example of just how tiny Silicon Valley can really be, because not only is he a customer and an API partner, Tony is also an investor for a VC firm that put money into Typekit. And in fact, Tony is on our board. So in a way, Tony's kind of my boss. And as that's occurring to me in this conversation, now all I'm thinking is this, right? Like, everything is done, and nothing is going to work, and the company is over. So this is happening, like I said, in December. In fact, it's happening on the Friday before Christmas, which, in the US at least, it's probably one of the most social weekends that you could have possibly imagined. And so now I sit down with the core group of engineers and say, you guys, we got to fix this. Like, this is what it comes down to. This is why we do startups. We have the ambition and the unlimited opportunity, but we also have this kind of responsibility where when the stuff doesn't work, we have to fix it. And bear in mind, people are getting ready for Christmas parties and to visit their families and to go on ski holidays. This is a pretty big deal. So we get a core group, and one by one, everybody is sort of in and said, okay, let's do this. And we start to make a plan. The following Monday, we're going to get 10 times more traffic than is already kind of crippling us right now. So that gives us 3 days. And the plan is then, very quickly, we decide that on the 17th, we will do everything we can to identify the problem and define it as clearly as we can and start to articulate a solution. That solution we will then build, whatever it happens to be. We will spend all day Saturday the 18th building it, and then integrate, test, and deliver it on the Sunday. So we get to work. The first thing we did was to get that core group of engineers into a room and left completely alone. I love this photo, not because I think web development is anything like rocket science, but I think there's a lot we can learn from stuff like this, in that every single person has exactly one job to do, and they know exactly what that job is. There's clear communication. Everybody has the data they need, and they're isolated in their own room with nobody to bother them. So we tried to create an environment like that, where everybody knew exactly what their jobs were, including one person who, in that room, their job was to come out and tell us what they needed or what they'd learned at a periodic basis. So we wouldn't bother them at all. We entirely let them alone. Then, the rest of the company, with them doing the work they need to do, we removed all the business decisions from solving the technical problems. They didn't have to worry about partners. They didn't have to worry about customer support. None of that. Just solve the problem. And that was a commitment that I made to them. Don't worry about any of that stuff. Just do what you have to do. And then finally, we provide them with all the moral support that they need. This is such a San Francisco startup refrigerator because all that's in there is microbrew and soy milk. So that's it. But we give them what they need. So this is where the equanimity comes in, right? We had spent time setting up the conditions for success. We had used structure, this is interesting, used structure to manage anxiety. That is, in an incredibly emotional situation, we fell back on a very structured set of things that we would do and clearly communicate those to try to add some kind of rational balance to the exceptionally emotional period that we were in. And that's where we looked to find the equanimity for the team. Do the job you have to do. Don't worry about all the fear and all the anger that we might have over the fact that we're in this situation. So, December 17th, they were spent identifying what the problem was. And what we saw was we were having no problem whatsoever making kits. So people would push the publish button instantly, microseconds, milliseconds would be, we'd have the kit available and waiting. And we tested extensively, and we had plenty of bandwidth between us and where the CDN was. So the pipes were fine, wide open, easy. But everything was just bouncing off as we went to the origin server. So something was going on there. Unable to really diagnose it with the partner that we had, we had to sort of make a call. And that's what we started working on the 18th, is that we would take the stock origin server that the CDN was providing us and ignore it, and instead build our own. Which, for the first time, we sort of caught a break, in that we had been planning on doing that. It was going to give us better caching and more performance, the ability to do dynamic subsetting and things like that for our fonts. We really needed to do this work at some point. The problem was it was about a 3 or 4 month project, and instead we were just going to do it on Saturday. So they did, as you can imagine, a minimum viable product. And I mean really minimum. So much so that it was going to require overnight hand-holding and basically no features except the performance layer of pumping the kits back out. And they got to work on it. We all went to bed after midnight. One person stayed up watching as we worked on it. And the next morning, we had just barely viable origin server delivering the kits, and they had moved out, and we had caught up, and we were ready for Monday. Monday came, the fonts were showing up on all of the partner websites. We had a tremendous amount of traffic, 10 times what we had before, but that was now in all of those charts the new normal, the new baseline. So we had sort of gotten over that hump, caught up, and we're now ready to do the real work of providing an actually robust server that we had. You can see the sort of pride that came from this work here in our back-end architect, Paul Hammond, posted this tweet. Yeah, and we launched it all on December 19th. Paul now runs the platform and all the integrations that you all use every day in Slack. That's his new job. He's pretty remarkable at what he does. So what did we learn from all of this? Well, there's a few things. Each one of these things could be a talk on their own, but I'll just focus on one of them. The first thing is that the world is a complex and disorderly place, and that no matter how on top of things we are always, always connected to everything else, and everything else always breaks. And we have to design from that point of view, the point of view that everything we depend on, which is almost everything else in the world, will at some point break. That a giant storm will sweep across Virginia and knock out part of Amazon one day. And AWS, for a few moments, will be down, and everything else will go with it. Stuff like that is always going to happen. The other thing it points out is that everything we do is user experience. And that kind of maps to the career that I've had over these past years, which stems from a frustration that the work that I wanted to do to create a better experience often felt constrained, often artificially, by the other parts of the business that I didn't have control over. That I would try to create what I felt was an honest and an appropriate user experience, but couldn't do that because of the business model at the place I worked, or because of the partnerships that were being developed with other companies that we were doing, or because of the way the marketing was happening. None of it was conducive to actually making the best possible user experience. But by kind of climbing up over time and eventually founding my own company and my own startup, it was as a result the ability to use a user experience process in every single part of our company. But perhaps the biggest thing we learned is that teams thrive when they can develop this sense of equanimity. So I want to talk about that a little bit in the context of how we do that as a team, and in a context in how all of you can be the creative leadership in the organizations that you work for. So I look for analogies all over the place. One of the places that I've found some analogies for how we do this as a team is in the world of professional cycling, of which, weirdly, as an American, I'm a big fan of. Professional cycling appears to be a very individual sport, a very chaotic sport, especially the way it is today. It's changed a lot from its earliest days where, for example, there was a lot more smoking during the races. They don't do that nearly as much as they used to. But there's this one thing that happens in almost every bicycle race, is that somebody will be leading a multi-stage race, and in the morning, before the stage happens, all the reporters will come up and they'll crowd around this person who is leading the race, and they will ask them, "How do you feel today? What do you think your chances are?" And inevitably, this person says, "I will win. just like that, the confidence, right? It's remarkable, and not surprising in professional sports to see that kind of confidence. And inevitably, somebody does come across the line, and all the reporters will crowd around them and say, oh my God, you did, that was amazing, how did you do that? And inevitably, this is what they reply. The team was very strong. And that's because cycling is, despite the individual achievement, very much a team sport, and it's based on, physics, right? If you follow somebody very closely, it's easier because they move the wind out of the way for you, and you use less energy, and you can win that way. And that's where the beauty of the strategy of cycling comes back, right? From a team sport, for people working together for a common goal to achieve that. But that phrase, the team was very strong, always sticks with me. I also find inspiration in the creative arts, obviously. So I read this interview recently with Steven Soderbergh, the film director. And he was talking about what he does as a director on the set with his actors. And he said, some people believe that tension is a good creative tool. I'm not one of those people. I really respect that. I don't like to create an environment of anxiety or tension, right? To try to get the most performance out of people. And I can really respect what he has to say about this. In fact, he says he's not trying to control his actors, and he wants to amplify whatever it is he finds compelling about them. And I really like this. He tries to keep the environment pretty relaxed, but focused. Now, this is hard to do. This is really hard to do because we don't learn creative leadership when we go to school. In fact, most of what we're taught about how to do work comes from educational institutions that were designed when work looked like this. And we don't work like this anymore. This was a time when the things that we're focused on were productivity and optimization. And how much can you squeeze out of the human capital that you have available in your factory? Instead, I like to think about the creative environment, the thing Soderbergh was talking about, right? And when I mean creative environment, I don't just mean hip startup offices that have nice architecture. What I mean is a place where a team can work, where they feel things like shared values, that they trust one another, that they feel a sense of camaraderie, that they feel safe being as creative as they possibly can, because creativity is inevitably dozens and dozens of terrible ideas until the good one comes out. And to feel safe and to be able to do that in front of a group of people is the kind of environment we want to create. We get confused all the time when we see these news reports of these startups, and all we think about are the free headphones and free lunch and the microbrew everywhere, and that's what it must be to work at a startup. But what it really should be about is that shared sense of values and trust in each other. So I want to talk about that and how to cultivate that with a few examples from some of the work that we did. And ironically, I want to do that by talking about a series of meetings that we would hold as we developed Typekit. I say ironically because I'm not a very big fan of meetings, and I think that's why our meetings were so successful, because this is what they generally mean to me. That if you are lonely and tired of working on your own, you can throw a meeting, which is the practical alternative to work. Meetings can feel that way. They can feel pointless. They can feel like a waste of time. But we had a set of these meetings that we would use throughout our work that I felt helped us to create this sense of equanimity among the team. The first meeting is actually not a meeting at all, but it is, in fact, how probably most of you are starting to do your work as well, which is in the chat room. And I call it meeting 0 because my engineers finally got me to start counting counting with 0, and that made them very happy. The chat room is interesting for a bunch of reasons. One of the reasons is because I think email is inherently corrupt. It is for a bunch of reasons, the asymmetry of the permission model and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's important for all of us to act distributed and over-communicate, even if we aren't, even if we're all in the same room. Use the skills of being distributed while we communicate with one another for crystal clarity. Chat does that. Email, I don't think, does that very well, right? Email is a document. We open a new document. It looks like I should type paragraphs into that, and that's what everybody does. Right? So you get this sort of extended communication rather than compression of communication that chat brings us. How many of you, for example, getting a 4 or 5 paragraph email from your boss saying, I need this, and I think we should do this, and all of this kind of stuff, would write back with the single word, no? How many people here? A couple people? Good. Cool, cool, cool. Yeah, right. We don't. It's not the form. It's not the way communication works. But with chat, we can compress that. It's one of the most wonderful parts of using real-time chat is that you can get work done like this. This is very common. This is very typical way of getting things done during the day. It could have been 3 or 4 emails going back and forth with big explanations, but instead, it's happening in real time, and it works really well. So communication compression is interesting, but so are the robots that help us do our work. One of the ways I think that Slack has excelled is with all of those integrations that are possible. And one of the things that we did was made very clear that the information you needed to do your work was only available in the chat room and not elsewhere, which made everybody come in, which created a culture where people were all the time and kept everybody up to speed on everything that was happening. The other thing that it did was created this sense of ambient accountability, which is you could kind of get a sense of all the work that people were doing and how well they were doing and whether they needed help or whether they were struggling, because all of the stuff that people were doing was coming into the chat room and was visible to everybody, right? So not only did we get code deploys and pull requests, but even support tickets or big sales that we happen to do on the enterprise side, stuff like that, right? And obviously, we would get all the latest animated GIFs. Very important, right? But it actually really is. It's actually part of a healthy, vibrant culture. When you do something big and you make a big code deploy that you've been working on for months, and you go to the chat room after GitHub sort of spits the output into the room, and you find something like this. Feels good. It's people telling each other that they appreciate one another. And the ultimate, right? Like the ultimate thing that you could ever get in the chat room, of course, is the Chuck Norris seal of approval. What else do you need? So that's the sort of anti-meeting, the chat room. Let's talk about that stand-up that I mentioned earlier. Like I said, I was always very frustrated with meetings. And one of the things we did, one of the things we found is that in our distributed nature of the team, it was very easy for people to feel adrift. So we created this daily check-in where we sort of started the day with a meeting that we aimed to be as quick as we possibly can to just get through the things that were happening. So these were sort of the rules for our daily stand-up. First, we started it at 10:05 because then nobody would be late. I don't know why that works, but it does. If it's at 10 o'clock, we never got started till 10:15. But if we put it on the calendar at 10:05, everybody was there. Go figure. Every single person in the company would come to the stand-up. Now, granted, in the time that we were a startup, we really only got to about 30 people, so it was manageable. But every single person, every day, would spend starting their morning in this stand-up. And one of the rules we had when we had a meeting that big that happened every day is that nobody gets to talk. The only people that get to talk are the person running the meeting and the people who are leading a project with their status report. So it goes quickly. What's happening? What's next? Why are you stuck? What do you need? Great, hook up with them, but do it after the meeting. And we would just fly through this stuff over and over again. Nobody was allowed to have laptops or phones or anything. We all were there live in person at the table. And very important, no problem solving whatsoever. It's so tempting when somebody says, oh, I know what's wrong. Oh, yeah, we could do that. All right, great. And suddenly, 2 people are having a meeting while 28 other people are sitting around waiting for them to solve their problem. Everything else happened offline. So that start at 10:05, by 10:20 we would be done every day. The rest of that hour would be people solving the problems that were uncovered at the stand-up. But everybody was doing that in parallel or getting back to work if they needed to. So tools, people always tell me, product management tools, what did you guys use? How did you keep track of everything? Yep, this is pretty much it, text file that we would just start a new one every day and write over what had changed and then email it out to everybody. That's pretty much all we needed for probably about 2.5 years. We started growing, started using Trello and stuff like that, but the meeting really ran around this daily email that went out to everybody on the team. Now, one of the guys on the team actually who now runs Typekit at Adobe, now that I've left, is here in the audience. His name's Matthew Rex. We hired him originally years ago as the head of sales. This was his first impression. He said he was taking notes. He shared these with me later. about what it was like the first week at Typekit going to this stand-up. He said, the daily status call demands surgical precision. Each lasts no longer than 70 seconds. He's a little bit of hyperbole from time to time. But yeah, you have 9 syllables to make your point. Choose them wisely. That's what it felt like. We got through it so quickly. And to be perfectly honest, I think everybody really sort of enjoyed it. Up to speed on everything that's happening in the company. It takes 15 to 20 minutes, and that's it, and we're all out. Nobody's time is wasted. Now, those accumulate up into once a week, then everybody getting together and sharing their work. And I thought that was an important part of the momentum of our company as well. So we would have a meeting on Friday afternoon with beers, and we would do a beautiful deck, and we would share the sort of things that had happened in the course of the week. And as we got good at it, they sort of turned into these like mini little TED Talks, and they were wonderful. We would share the data, and we would have this dashboard that we would bring up, and we would talk through anything that was changing or wasn't changing fast enough and things like that. We would show the latest round of iterations we've done on A/B testing and the results of all of that. The development team would be talking about the issues that they closed that week and how many and what the trend was looking like, and also all the things that have shipped. New fonts that we would have released, but also really personal things. Sometimes people just wanted to teach. We hired somebody from England, and they came over, and this was during the Olympics, so they taught us how that worked. And sometimes people had events that just were very meaningful to them and wanted to share. The point of all of that is that the team felt like work was getting done and that they had the opportunity to share it, and that the bar was pretty high for how beautiful we made the presentation of our work, because all of that was part of a culture of valuing design in everything and in every level of the company. That really played out in the next meeting, which we would do probably once or twice a week, depending on the status of all the projects, which was our product review. This is actually the room that Frank Lloyd Wright had in his studio, where he would gather around all his students and they would show off their work. I love this idea that room still exists and is kind of preserved as a place where people would put up their new work and the critique would happen. I first experienced product review in a real way when I worked at Google years ago, and they were just terrible. So you would come in as a designer with your idea, your beautiful idea, and you would sort of tell everybody what your idea was, and the response was pretty much a bunch of engineers just kind of shooting down your idea. And it was awful, right? But we had no skills in this team that I was exposed to at Google for doing good product review and giving good feedback and actually solving problems together. So we've worked on this, and I have some ideas around this stuff now. So in product review, it's not the mandatory meeting that we have in stand-up. It is an optional meeting, but participation is mandatory. We're there to work, right? This isn't just us sitting around and kicking some ideas around. We're there to work and to solve a bunch of problems, and we're not going to leave the room until we get those problems solved. But how we do that is to generally look at a bunch of people's work and make very clear that we're not just, we have a forum here for a bunch of opinions. So let me show you what I mean by that. So this is bad feedback. I don't like that blue. What do you do with that? It's almost insulting to give somebody feedback like that. Well, there's the design, I don't like the blue. Look at this feedback instead. Why is that blue? We've turned it from a direct piece of opinion to an opening of a conversation. Now you can talk, right? You get at the motivations for the decisions that went into the design that you're looking at. Even better than this, is color important here? What level are we having a conversation about the things we're looking at, right? What also helps is in the context of the meeting, when we start, we talk about whether or not we're going to have a convergent meeting or a divergent meeting. Now let me explain what that means, right? Think of all the ideas that you could possibly, all the solutions to a problem you could possibly have, all the ideas that would solve the problem you're looking at. That's a divergent meeting. That's like, we're going to solve this new problem. Let's get all the ideas we possibly can out onto the table so that we can discuss them. This is brainstorming, right? This is limitless possibility. This is always saying yes to every idea and then building on top of it. Kind of like how improv works when two actors are on stage and one actor says, well, this is quite a bus, and the other person says, not really. Well, you're done, right? Like there's nowhere you go from there. But if you always say yes and you build on it, we can get broader and broader and broader. And in the possible space of finding ideas that might solve the problem we're trying to solve. But think about design reviews and product reviews that come later, where they converge on one idea. Here is where we start to evaluate the feasibility of the design, to acknowledge what the constraints really are, to really drive towards consensus. Most problems when reviewing designs or reviewing any part of a product come from people mixing this stuff up. One person is brainstorming, the other person is trying to get to the correct solution and talk about the constraints and why we can't do this. And that's where the friction comes. If we clearly identify at the beginning of each one of these meetings which kind of meeting it is, it goes so much better. Then enforce that throughout the whole meeting. Everybody was invited to come to this, like I said, engineers alike. One thing that was really important in the culture of our company, though, was user testing. And I'm a firm believer in user testing with the right perspective. I think far too often people do this kind of usability testing with a quantitative approach to it. I saw 4 users fail, therefore the design sucks. That's not at all how I use this. The only thing I use usability testing for is to build empathy, to see users use my product, to understand them better so that I can have moments of inspiration while I'm watching them do that to what a better solution might possibly be. It is purely qualitative, so qualitative that I consider it almost like thumbing through magazines or going to the museum. Like it is that kind of inspiration that I look for. But more exposure to users gives everybody on the team better design instincts. Everybody, even the developers, even salespeople, marketing people. I want them all to come and watch people use the product. That just drives a very user-centered culture in an organization. We also spent a lot of time looking at great design. We would browse around Behance with the portfolio site and pick out wonderful work and talk about it as a team. Because the more exposure to great work across the board with everybody on the team, the better vocabulary they had to be able to talk about design. And that made us overall better as a team. Because what we're driving towards as a team, collectively, is a shared understanding of good taste. It's something I think can be cultivated. I don't think it's something you're just born with and have for the rest of your life. It's a thing that we as a team can get better at, to have good taste, to value good design, and to really be ambitious in developing it. So the next meeting, actually the last meeting we're going to talk about, is one we never really want to have, and that's the post-mortem. That's when something goes terribly, terribly wrong, and we have to meet after it happens to figure out why it happened. And a lot of the techniques for these kind of meetings come from the industrial process, the quality engineering, like looking for defects in manufacturing and stuff like that, which is why I have that image. So you remember this guy, right? We, like I said, believed that user experience was part of everything. That meant even the processes that we use to develop our code would contribute to the user experience. And in our case, we had a relatively contemporary process of doing test-driven development with continuous integration and multiple deploys a day. But what that also sets up is a situation where every day there is the potential to not only deploy all the code, but for something to go terribly, terribly wrong, to have outage, to have the site go down, to have the service affected in some way, to decrease the performance, to have a regression in some of the bugs that may have at one point been fixed. All of those things can happen. But here's the key to this, right? When those sorts of bad things happen, the person who pushed the button that made the code go to the server to do bad things thought they were doing the right thing every single time. Nobody willingly pushes the button to do something bad. If they do, that's not somebody that's going to be on the team very long. Nobody does that willingly. Everybody thinks when they push the button, a good thing is going to happen. And when a bad thing happens, where do we look? It's human nature to look for the villain. It's to say not what happened, but who did it. This is so well documented in psychology that there's a term for it. It's called the fundamental attribution error. And that is when something bad happens, we assume it's the attributes of the person and not the circumstances they were in that's the problem. That person's an idiot, and that person doesn't know what they're doing, and they screwed up again. That's an incredibly human thing for us to feel. and almost entirely misplaced. And think about trying to create this culture, right, that allows for creativity, that allows for people to experiment and to occasionally make mistakes and feel all right about that because they feel in a safe, protective environment. This basic part of human nature is exactly at odds with that. So what do we do about that? Well, I found, again, inspiration by looking into a person named Sakichi Toyoda. He is widely considered one of the key people to bring Japan out of the post-World War II kind of devastation that their economy was in, and bring them and sort of make made in Japan into something that was really meaningful through an industrialization process over there. One of the things he focused on was quality, right? And one of the ways that he would try to identify how defects happened in the quality of the manufacturing was really simple. He just asked why, but he made a process of it, and he always asked why 5 times. And it gets to this thing called the 5 whys, which is really root cause analysis. And let me give you an example. There's this story from Amazon's early history. It might be apocryphal, I'm not sure, but it's a good one. Where Jeff Bezos goes to one of the warehouses, and the whole warehouse is shut down. And he's like, what happened? And it turns out that an employee had injured his thumb while working on the line. And so he gets a whiteboard and he writes number 1, and he says, why did that happen? And they say, well, the employee's thumb got caught in the conveyor belt. And he's like, okay, why did that happen? And they said, well, the employee was chasing his bag. And he's like, why did that happen? Well, he put the bag on the conveyor belt, and then the conveyor belt started up accidentally, unexpectedly. And he's like, well, why was it on the conveyor belt? And he's like, well, he was using it as a table. Why is that? Because he had no place to store his belongings. So our immediate instinct to say that guy is responsible for the whole factory shutting down is instead turns out to be a problem that the company has not provided employees any personal space to store their stuff, and so they're always juggling their stuff, and this was the result one time. Root cause analysis. Very simply, right? We were, Kit Publishing was taking over an hour, and everything was backing up in that scenario I told you earlier. The reason was that we identified was, well, this queue is growing, and that's because the kits are not being delivered, because the origin server is not accepting the kits, we finally figured out. The vendor's origin servers, it turns out, were never designed for this, for high input, only high output. And why did we not figure that out? Because input rate on the origin server was not defined as a requirement a year ago. It just never came up. It never occurred to anybody when we were doing the initial architecture of the system. So we found the root cause. We needed to provide our own origin server. Theirs never was going to work. So 5 times asking why, getting us to root cause. All of these meetings sort of accumulate over time, right? They all happen at different paces and lead to a sense of momentum. And we ask ourselves, we can sort of step back and look at that. And we can look at the real-time chat, and we can look at the daily stand-up meetings and how they kind of come together in a weekly review of all of our work. And that helps us measure the momentum that's happening day by day. We can say, that was a good week, everybody. It's lots of progress, good-looking numbers, nice job. Gives us a sense of momentum. But we can zoom out from that a little bit as well, and we can start to measure the projects that we're doing as they happen week by week by week. And we can say the next milestone will get us to that minimum viable feature that we need for South by Southwest or whatever our next big milestone is. Measuring projects now, zooming out. We can zoom back a little farther, right? And we can measure the priorities that our company has as they happen month by month and quarter by quarter. And we can say we're going to focus on performance and distribution next quarter, or whatever they happen to be. But that gives, again, a sense of perspective of why we're doing this work and how we're moving towards those milestones. We can even zoom out farther, right? We can zoom out into measuring vision, which happens in a yearly time frame. You think about how companies talk about their vision, how Google, for example, talks about organizing the world's information, making it universally accessible. Every employee can see that every line of code, or every customer they talk to, or every pixel they arrange in a design is moving us towards this ultimate goal here of organizing the world's information. That helps frame everything, and everybody knows what they're working on in that case. But I think we can zoom out even a step further that goes beyond even all the individual companies that we work for. I think we can talk about purpose. And purpose, I believe, is timeless. It's the reason why we're doing what we're doing. There's this idea, this concept in Japan. It's called ikigai, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong. But translated, it means the purpose for your life. And this has been incredibly well studied in Japan. They've done these extensive multi-year, multi-decade studies with tens of thousands of individuals in them, asking them about their purpose for life. And the people who have a clear and crisp answer also have less cardiovascular disease. They live longer. Their life expectancy is longer when they clearly know what they're working on and how they're contributing to it. And we see this throughout all the cultures in the world. And it's not just in Japan, but in France, you hear about the raison d'etre. We have that in the sort of Judeo-Christian tradition, where we talk about God's divine will and things like that, our purpose in life. The Buddhists have this concept of nirvana, this ultimate goal that we have, this purpose, this reason. All of these things reminds me of a story that I came across reading to my children not long ago in the original Winnie the Pooh book, not the weird one that Disney did later. But the original one has this really good story that kind of captures all of this. And it starts with Piglet saying to Winnie the Pooh, "When you wake up in the morning, Pooh, what's the first thing you say to yourself?" And the bear responds, "What's for breakfast?" And then he asks, "What do you say, Piglet?" And the pig responds, "I say, I wonder what's going to happen exciting today." And then Winnie the Pooh says, "Well, that's the same thing," which I like. But what's going to happen that's exciting today? What is going to take us another step closer to our purpose? And I think that the work we do on the web or our connected devices or anything in our networked world that is bound together by this internet we're working on is connected with a purpose that traces all the way back to the beginning of the invention of literacy. I mean, honestly, I think what Jeremy was talking about when he talked about the web being not a platform but a continuum can be zoomed out far, far farther to almost all of technology that we have been developing to help us communicate with one another. Literacy, the invention of literacy is widely considered to be the reason why some civilizations thrived and others that didn't have it failed. It was the ability to communicate across generations and across geography. It's like we invented both teleporting and time travel with the same device, because we can have an idea, we can figure something out, we can see something that works and works better than what we did before, and we can write it down and other people can read it without us having to tell them in person. And almost all of the technology that has happened for thousands of years has been us getting better at sharing ideas with one another and in distributing the knowledge that we have accumulated and making it and optimizing it, making it faster and easier. We were wrong about most of what we were inventing when we invented computers. We thought it was about computing when in fact it was about communicating. And again, we got more personal, we got it easier to use, more widely distributed, more distributed and more democratized than it has ever been before. We get it wrong sometimes, but it's still progress. Everything we invent to help us share, to help us connect, to help us teach each other, all of that is driving us towards moving civilization further forward. And that's what I think we all do. And I think that's what we can be excited about when we do our work. This is what we're building. This is what the world looks like today. This is what you're contributing to. So I hope that you can find a way to balance, to find this sort of wise balance in between the fear of all of this new change that's happening every day and the excitement of how we can contribute to it and how we can keep building all of it. I wish you all the best of luck as we all work on this together. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Good night.